Phil is holding Courtney's phone, but what he has discovered is not some obvious cheating confession, a secret hotel reservation, or a message saying she is in love with another man. In some ways, what he finds feels even worse. He is looking at evidence that Courtney has been quietly preparing for a life without him. Money she has been putting aside. Conversations about where she could stay. Discussions about what she would do if the relationship suddenly ended. And apparently, someone else has been helping her think through all of it. Then, Phil reaches one message that changes the entire mood. Courtney apparently says she just needs to figure out the right time to leave. Imagine seeing that from Phil's position. You think the relationship is struggling, but you still believe both of you are trying to repair it. You think the difficult conversations are about saving the future. You believe the arguments are painful because both people still care. Then suddenly, you discover your partner has been discussing an exit strategy behind your back. Phil looks at Courtney and asks the question she clearly did not want to answer. How long were you planning to leave me? Courtney freezes. But this fictional situation is not as simple as Courtney getting caught planning some cruel betrayal. Courtney says she was not secretly replacing Phil. She insists there was no hidden romance. According to her, this was about protection. She says she reached a point where the relationship felt so unstable that she needed to know she could survive if everything collapsed. And that immediately creates a much harder question. Was Courtney secretly betraying Phil while continuing to promise him a future? Or did Phil and Courtney's relationship become so unpredictable that Courtney felt she needed an emergency exit just to feel safe enough to stay? Because those are two completely different versions of what happened. And there is another detail that Phil cannot get past. Another person apparently knew Courtney was thinking about leaving before Phil did. That may be the most painful part. Courtney had somebody else helping her process the possibility that her relationship was ending, while Phil was still inside that relationship, wondering why she seemed so distant. So this stops being a story about one suspicious phone. It becomes a story about two people who may have lost trust in each other long before either one admitted it out loud. And once you see that, almost everything that happened before the phone discovery starts looking different. Courtney had already been pulling away. Not dramatically. That is important. There was no giant announcement, no suitcase sitting by the door, no screaming declaration that she was finished. She was still there. She was still talking to Phil. She may have still been saying she loved him, but emotionally, something had changed. Phil would ask about their future, and Courtney would become vague. He would try to get a straight answer about where they were heading, and she would seem uncomfortable. He wanted certainty. Courtney seemed to want space. At first, that can look like a normal relationship problem. Maybe one person wants to move faster than the other. Maybe Courtney is overwhelmed. Maybe Phil is anxious. Maybe they just need better communication. Then there is the phone. Courtney gets a late-night message and turns the screen over. Now, somebody turning their phone face down is not automatically proof of anything. That is where commentary channels have to be careful. Privacy is not guilt. A partner does not lose the right to private conversations simply because they are in a relationship. But when trust has already weakened, small behaviors start carrying much bigger meanings. Phil does not see Courtney turn over the phone and think, she probably wants privacy. He thinks, what is she hiding? And Courtney does not hear Phil asking questions and think, maybe he is genuinely scared of losing me. She hears pressure. That is the real problem. They have stopped interpreting each other generously. And once a relationship reaches that point, almost anything can become evidence. A late reply becomes evidence. A quiet mood becomes evidence. A vague answer becomes evidence. A private conversation becomes evidence. Both people start building cases against each other without realizing that they are no longer behaving like partners. They are behaving like opposing attorneys. Phil asks who messaged her. Courtney says, nobody important. And that sentence becomes explosive later. Because once Phil discovers that this supposedly unimportant person has apparently been helping Courtney think through what happens if she leaves him, Phil does not just question who that person is. He questions his own position in Courtney's life. Why did somebody Courtney describes as unimportant know about these fears? Why did they know she was considering leaving? Why did they know about her financial concerns? Why did they understand how unstable Courtney believed the relationship had become when Phil apparently did not? That is where emotional intimacy becomes the bigger issue. Courtney insists nothing romantic happened, and within this fictional story, we should take that claim seriously, unless something proves otherwise. So this is not about accusing Courtney of physical cheating. The deeper question is whether she emotionally moved part of her relationship somewhere else, because there is a specific pain in realizing your partner has been talking through the possible end of your relationship with another person before talking honestly about it with you. It can make you feel like your breakup started privately, before you ever knew there was a breakup coming. Phil thought he was still trying to understand what was wrong. Meanwhile, somebody else apparently already understood that Courtney had considered leaving. That would sting. But Courtney sees the same situation completely differently. She says talking to Phil had become too difficult. That is the sentence that changes this from a simple betrayal story into a relationship autopsy. Phil's position is that Courtney stopped being honest. Courtney's position is that honesty with Phil stopped feeling emotionally safe. Both statements can be true. And if they are both true, then we can see exactly how the relationship got trapped. Courtney hides something because she expects Phil to react badly. Phil senses she is hiding something, so he becomes more suspicious. Courtney feels the suspicion and becomes even more private. Phil sees that privacy and thinks his suspicion has been confirmed. Courtney then tells herself, "See, this is why I cannot talk to him." Phil tells himself, "See, this is why I cannot trust her." Nobody has to wake up one morning and decide to destroy the relationship. The cycle does it for them. That is what makes this dynamic interesting. The problem is not one villain and one victim. The problem is that their worst instincts keep activating each other. Phil wants reassurance because he is afraid Courtney is leaving. Courtney feels pressured by that demand for reassurance, so she pulls back. Her pulling back makes Phil even more afraid she is leaving. Then he asks for even more reassurance. And eventually, Courtney may start feeling like her independence itself is being treated as suspicious. That brings us to the money. Courtney has apparently been quietly setting money aside so she could support herself if the relationship ended. And this is where a lot of viewers would probably immediately disagree with each other. Some would hear secret money and assume deception. Others would say every adult should have access to their own money and never feel financially trapped. I think the second point matters. Courtney having personal savings is not automatically a red flag. Wanting financial independence is not betrayal. Nobody should be forced to remain in a relationship because leaving would make them homeless, broke, or completely dependent. In fact, Courtney wanting the ability to support herself could be seen as responsible. But that is not really why Phil is upset. The emotional meaning of the money is what bothers him. Phil believed they were planning one future together. Courtney was also preparing herself for another future where Phil was not there. That is the part he cannot ignore. From his perspective, this is not about controlling Courtney's money. It is about information. Courtney knew she felt scared enough to prepare an exit. Phil did not know the relationship had reached that level of danger. That creates a huge imbalance. One partner believes, we are struggling, but we are fixing this. The other partner is thinking, I need to make sure I can leave if this gets worse. Those people are not operating with the same information. And that is why secrecy can do so much damage. It does not only change the present, it starts rewriting the past. Phil begins remembering every previous conversation differently. That hesitation Courtney had when he talked about future plans suddenly feels suspicious. That argument he thought they resolved suddenly does not feel resolved. That moment Courtney told him they would figure things out now sounds different. Was she really committed to figuring it out? Or was she trying to keep things calm until she felt ready to leave? Maybe Phil is reading too much into those old moments. That is possible. But once trust breaks, the mind starts going backward, searching for clues. People replay conversation. They remember strange expression. They question explanations they accepted months earlier. And suddenly, the secret does not feel like one secret. It starts making the entire history of the relationship feel unreliable. Courtney pushes back with what may be her strongest argument. Preparing for the worst doesn't mean I wanted it to happen, and she is right about that. Preparation is not automatically intention. People save emergency money without hoping for an emergency. They make backup plans without wanting their first plan to fail. They keep important documents accessible without expecting to suddenly need them. Courtney could genuinely love Phil and still be afraid the relationship might collapse. Those two emotions are not mutually exclusive. People can love someone and still not trust the stability of the relationship. People can want a relationship to work and still protect themselves in case it does not. That is what Phil now has to figure out. Did Courtney create this plan because she had already emotionally chosen to leave? Or did she create it because she was terrified Phil might leave first and she did not want to be helpless? Those are very different motivations. But then Phil asks another question. Who was helping her plan this? Courtney goes quiet. And in a moment like that, silence does almost as much damage as a bad answer. Because Phil's imagination immediately fills the space. Another man? An ex? Someone waiting for Courtney? Was she preparing to leave him for someone else? That is exactly how suspicion works. When trust is already damaged, unanswered questions get answered by fear. Courtney finally explains that the person she has been talking with is someone she had a close emotional history with. And even though she insists nothing romantic happened, Phil immediately reacts to that history. Because now, the situation looks different again. This is not just Courtney asking a random friend for advice. In Phil's mind, this is someone who already had emotional importance in Courtney's life. And during the weakest period of their relationship, Courtney turned toward that person instead of toward Phil. That can feel like emotional replacement. Physical cheating is easier to define. Something happened, or it did not. Emotional betrayal can be much harder because everybody draws the line differently. When does friendship become emotional dependence? When does asking someone for advice cross into allowing them into a space that should belong to your partner? When does privacy become secrecy? There is no universal answer. But Phil clearly feels that a line was crossed. He thought that as Courtney's partner, he should be the person she came to with her deepest fears about their relationship. Instead, somebody else knew she might leave. Somebody else knew she was scared. Somebody else apparently knew about the practical planning. Somebody else was helping her picture what her life after Phil might look like. So Phil asks the question that makes Courtney's explanation much harder for him to accept. Did that person know Courtney was thinking about ending the relationship? Yes. Did they know before Phil? Yes, that is brutal. Phil says, a stranger knew our relationship was ending before I did. And whether the word stranger is technically fair almost does not matter. He is expressing how excluded he feels from his own relationship. Courtney responds that every time she tried talking to Phil, he turned the conversation into a fight. And that is where the real conflict is finally exposed. Phil says, you did not tell me the truth. Courtney is basically saying, I did not feel like I could tell you the truth. Those are not separate problems. They are connected. And that connection explains why these two cannot seem to move forward. Phil believes Courtney never fully committed. Courtney believes Phil constantly demanded proof of commitment. Phil sees her independence as evidence that she is keeping one foot outside the relationship. Courtney sees his need for reassurance as the reason she needs to keep one foot outside. Phil wants certainty. Courtney wants freedom. Those two needs do not have to destroy a relationship, but they will if each person interprets the other person's need as a threat. Phil experiences security through certainty. He wants Courtney to say, I am here. I am staying. We are building this together. He wants plans. He wants consistency. He wants reassurance that he is not investing emotionally in somebody who is already halfway out the door. Courtney appears to experience security in almost the opposite way. She wants to know that she could leave and survive if she ever had to. For her, having options may actually make staying feel safer, because then staying remains a choice. She does not want her relationship to become a situation where she is forced to remain because she has nowhere else to go. Neither desire sounds unreasonable when you describe it separately, but put them together and you get trouble. Phil sees Courtney creating independence and thinks she is preparing to abandon me. Courtney sees Phil demanding certainty and thinks he wants to take away my freedom. He pushes harder. She pulls away. He sees her pulling away and pushes harder again. That is how two people can accidentally create the exact outcome they are both afraid of. And then Courtney reveals something that completely changes the argument again. She had considered leaving before, but she did not. She says she changed her mind because she still loved Phil. Courtney probably expects that to be proof of commitment. She had doubts and still chose him. She could have left and stayed. Should that not count for something? Phil does not hear it that way. To Phil, this means Courtney got close enough to ending the relationship that she planned for it, discussed it with another person, organized herself financially, and then returned emotionally without ever telling him how serious the situation had become. He does not feel chosen. He feels uninformed. And there is a major difference. If someone tells you, I thought about leaving, but after thinking everything through, I chose us, that can sometimes become an honest conversation. But if you discover later that your partner reached that point without you knowing, it can feel like you were almost dumped by a relationship you did not even realize was ending. That is where Phil starts getting quiet. And honestly, that may be more dramatic than another screaming match. People usually think shouting means the situation is at its worst. Sometimes it does, but sometimes shouting means there is still energy left. Someone is still trying to convince the other person, still trying to be heard, still hoping the right sentence will change everything. Silence can mean something else. Silence can mean somebody has stopped looking for the right explanation because they no longer believe there is one. Courtney notices that shift. She tries again. I stayed. Doesn't that matter? Phil answers, not if you were secretly planning how to disappear. Courtney clearly does not see herself that way. She was not, according to her, planning to vanish one morning. She says she was protecting herself. And this is where intention and impact separate. Courtney's intention may have been self-protection. The impact on Phil is still betrayal. Courtney can sincerely say, I never meant to hurt you. Phil can sincerely answer, but you did. Both people can be telling the truth about their own emotional experience. And that is one reason some relationships become impossible to solve through one argument. You cannot fix emotional damage simply by proving you did not intend to cause it. Courtney apologizes for hiding the conversation. She insists those messages came from moments when she felt scared, angry, and uncertain. They were not, in her mind, evidence of some finalized plan to abandon Phil. And yes, people absolutely say dramatic things when relationships are going badly. Someone texts a friend saying, I am done. 2 hours later, they calm down. That happens. But Phil sees a difference between emotional venting and practical preparation. Courtney was not simply saying she was angry. There were questions about where she could stay. There were financial discussions. There were thoughts about what would happen next. The more detailed those conversations became, the harder it is for Phil to dismiss them as frustration. If somebody says, I want to quit my job, maybe they are venting. If they start updating their IRSM, interviewing somewhere else, calculating expenses, and planning their final day, the situation begins looking more serious. That is how Phil sees Courtney's plan. Maybe she never officially decided to leave, but she got close enough to the door that she learned how to open it. And then, something important happens. Phil does not demand to see more messages. He does not tell Courtney to block the other person. He does not ask for her password. He does not start negotiating. That is when Courtney realizes she may have lost control of the conversation completely. Phil says, you already planned your way out. I'm just making it easier. And he ends the relationship. That is the moment the entire power dynamic flips. Up until then, Phil has been afraid Courtney might leave him. Now Phil chooses to leave first. Courtney's backup plan existed because she did not want to feel powerless if the relationship suddenly ended. But the discovery of that backup plan gives Phil enough reason to end it himself. That irony is brutal. And Courtney immediately panics. But I do not think her panic proves she was lying about her earlier fears. Human emotions do not work that neatly. You can question a relationship for months and still be crushed when it ends. You can imagine leaving somebody and still panic when they leave you. You can prepare yourself for being alone and then realize that mentally imagining loneliness is very different from actually experiencing it. So Courtney gives Phil one final explanation. This is where the entire story gets much more uncomfortable. She says the exit plan did not begin because she stopped loving him. It began after one of their worst fights. According to Courtney, something Phil said during that argument made her realize that the relationship could disappear almost instantly. Maybe the relationship would end. Maybe the stability she thought she had would disappear. Maybe the future she had been planning would suddenly no longer exist. And Courtney realized she did not want to be emotionally and financially dependent on somebody if one explosive argument could change her entire life. So she started saving. She talked to someone she trusted. She figured out where she could go. She gave herself options, not necessarily because she wanted to leave, because she needed to know she could. That distinction matters. And if we accept Courtney's explanation inside this fictional storyline, then Phil cannot only look at the secret plan and ask why Courtney betrayed his trust. He has to ask why the relationship felt dangerous enough to Courtney that she thought a backup plan was necessary. Maybe her secrecy was wrong, but fear usually has a history. If every serious disagreement made Courtney wonder whether the relationship would survive until tomorrow, then simply telling her to trust Phil more would not solve the problem. Phil would have to look at the environment they created together. Did arguments become threats? Did both of them repeatedly make the relationship feel temporary? Did one person constantly fear abandonment while the other constantly fear dependence? Because if that was happening, Courtney's exit plan did not create the instability. It was evidence of instability that already existed. But Courtney still has responsibility. And this is important because it would be easy to swing too far in the other direction and treat everything she did as justified. Fear explains secrecy. It does not automatically excuse secrecy. If Courtney had reached the point where she genuinely believed she might need to leave, that was something Phil needed to understand. She did not have to give up control of her finances. She did not have to surrender her privacy. She did not have to tell Phil every private conversation she had. But if you are quietly preparing for your relationship to end while your partner believes you are still planning the same future together, there's a serious communication problem. Courtney may have been telling Phil enough to keep the relationship calm, but not enough for Phil to understand the truth. Phil may have been demanding certainty that Courtney could no longer honestly provide. That is where both of them failed. Phil wanted reassurance more than he wanted uncomfortable honesty. Courtney gave reassurance instead of uncomfortable honesty, and eventually the truth arrived in the worst possible way. Not through a mature conversation, through a phone. If this fictional storyline played out on 90 Day Fiancé, I think the fan reaction would be extremely divided. A large group of viewers would defend Phil. They would say Courtney emotionally left before she physically left. Those viewers would focus on the planning. They would argue that the moment Courtney began discussing where she would go, organizing money, and relying on somebody from her emotional past to help imagine life after Phil, she was already halfway out. They would probably say the lack of physical cheating does not erase the emotional betrayal. For them, the worst part would be that another person knew the relationship was in danger before Phil did. Some fans would probably say that if you are serious enough about leaving to create an organized backup plan, your partner deserves to know the relationship has reached that point. And honestly, that argument would be difficult to dismiss. But another group of viewers would strongly defend Courtney. They would say having private savings is healthy. They would argue that nobody should become so dependent on a partner that leaving becomes impossible. They would question why Courtney felt that one bad argument could leave her with nothing. Those viewers would probably say Phil is focusing on the existence of the escape plan because that allows him to avoid asking why Courtney believed she needed one. And that argument would also deserve attention. Then there would be a third group. The group saying both of them are focusing on the wrong thing. And that is probably where the deepest analysis lands. Because the biggest red flag is not Courtney's phone. It is not even the money. It is not the other person. The biggest red flag is that Phil and Courtney appear to have been experiencing two completely different relationships at the same time. Phil was trying to secure commitment. Courtney was trying to secure independence. Phil wanted proof she would stay. Courtney wanted proof she could leave. One was afraid of abandonment. The other was afraid of being trapped. Those fears pushed against each other until neither person felt secure. And if they tried getting back together after this, I think those problems would become even worse before they became better. Phil would probably become much more suspicious. Every time Courtney received a private message, he would remember this discovery. Every time she wanted financial independence, he might wonder whether she was preparing another exit. Every friendship with someone from Courtney's past might suddenly become a threat in his mind, and Courtney would probably react badly to that suspicion. She could become more defensive, more private, more protective of her phone, more determined to keep her money separate. Then Phil would look at that behavior and say, "See, nothing changed." Courtney would look at his suspicion and say exactly the same thing. That is not rebuilding trust. That is surveillance. And relationships cannot survive very long when both partners start acting like investigators. Real repair would require both of them to change the questions they are asking. Phil cannot keep asking, "How do I make sure Courtney never leaves?" There is no answer to that. You cannot guarantee another adult will never leave you. Courtney cannot keep asking, "How do I make sure I can escape without being hurt?" No backup plan can guarantee that either. They would have to ask something much harder. What would make this relationship secure enough that neither one of us spends every argument preparing for abandonment? And that would require uncomfortable honesty from both sides. Phil would have to admit how much his fear of losing Courtney may have turned into pressure. Courtney would have to admit that protecting herself became secrecy. Phil would have to accept Courtney's need for independence without automatically seeing it as rejection. Courtney would have to learn that independence does not require keeping major emotional truths hidden. Could they do that? Maybe. But after a discovery like this, it would take much more than one apology. Because the relationship now has a new memory attached to every future conflict. Courtney turns over her phone. Phil remembers the secret messages. Courtney wants separate savings. Phil remembers the exit plan. Phil asks for reassurance. Courtney remembers feeling trapped and pressured. One bad fight could reopen everything. And that is why I think even if Phil and Courtney reconciled quickly, the deeper conflict would probably return. Maybe not the next day. maybe not the next week, but eventually something would trigger it. And when it does, the argument would no longer be about whatever happened that day. It would become about this phone, this secret, this backup plan. This moment, Phil realized Courtney had imagined life without him. That is the real long-term damage. Courtney finally asks whether everything they had meant nothing. And Phil does not say it meant nothing. That is what makes his response hurt more. It mattered. It mattered enough that discovering this destroys him. If the relationship meant nothing, Phil would not care about the plan. He cares because he thought they were building something together. Courtney's fear may have been real. Her love may have been real. Her decision to stay may even have been real. But Phil's sense of betrayal is real too. And then he leaves. Courtney is left facing the cruelest irony in the entire story. She created an escape route because she was afraid Phil might leave her and she would not be ready. Phil discovered the escape route and interpreted it as proof that Courtney had already left him emotionally. So he ended things first. Courtney's plan was supposed to protect her from the breakup. Instead, it helped trigger the breakup. That is why the most interesting debate here is not whether Courtney technically cheated. Physical cheating is almost a distraction from the deeper issue. The real question is whether secretly building a future without your partner while continuing to talk publicly about a future with them can become its own kind of betrayal. Phil would probably say yes. Courtney would probably say no. She would say planning for survival is not the same as choosing to leave. And maybe both of them are right from their own perspective. But Phil cannot completely ignore the other side either. If your partner feels she needs separate money, a private emotional support system, and a detailed exit strategy just to feel safe inside your relationship, then something had already gone seriously wrong before you ever touched that phone. Maybe Courtney's secrecy destroyed the remaining trust, but the instability between Courtney and Phil may have created the fear that produced the secrecy, and that is the uncomfortable part. Sometimes the secret is not the original problem. Sometimes the secret is what grows after the original problem goes unresolved for too long. Phil sees betrayal. Courtney sees protection. Phil sees somebody preparing to leave him. Courtney sees herself making sure she is never trapped. Phil believes Courtney excluded him from the truth. Courtney believes Phil made the truth too dangerous to discuss. And now, neither person knows whether the other one created the problem or simply reacted badly to a problem that was already there. So if Phil came back tomorrow and Courtney promised she would never hide anything again, would that actually be enough? I do not think so. Because the phone is no longer the real issue. Trust is, security is, communication is, and most of all, the relationship would have to answer one question it avoided for far too long. Did Courtney create an escape plan because she was secretly finished with Phil? Or did she create an escape plan because Phil and Courtney had already built a relationship where she never felt certain she would be safe staying? Because depending on the answer, Phil either discovered Courtney's betrayal or discovered the warning signs they both ignored. And if you were Phil, what would you do? Would finding those messages, the money plan, and the conversations with someone from Courtney's emotional past be enough for you to walk away forever? Or would Courtney's explanation make you stop and ask what happened between them that made her believe she needed an exit before deciding who really betrayed whom? This story is fictional for entertainment.